Hi, I'm Emily, and today I'm going to talk about aerobic respiration. So before we go into the whole process, it's good to think about what is the reasoning behind breathing in oxygen and how that actually helps our body. So at the end of the day, we really need energy for our cells and how they function and for our activity each day. So when we go through cellular respiration, that helps the body create ATP, and oxygen is a major component in aerobic respiration to help make ATP and energy. Some processes don't need oxygen, such as anaerobic respiration, but today we're mostly going to focus on aerobic respiration. And ATP, I'm sure that all of you know what this is, but it's basically energy. It stood for adenosine triphosphate, and the main part of this, the most important part, is the 3 phosphate groups, because when it goes into energy, it breaks down and removes 1 phosphate, and that's like an exothermic reaction, just like releasing heat, but it's releasing energy instead. And this is where we get the energy from ATP. So after that whole breakdown, it becomes an ADP low energy molecule after removing that phosphate. So some other essential nutrients for this whole cellular respiration, for aerobic respiration, is carbohydrates, glucose, of course, and glycolysis, fats, lipids, and fatty acids, like pyruvic acid is going to be important, at least for anaerobic respiration, and proteins and amino acids. So, energy pathways. So some of you might think that we go straight to aerobic respiration and we need oxygen every single time we're trying to get energy. But it doesn't work that way. That's only if we're in activity or exercise that we need energy for a longer time and we need more energy. So the first step we would do for respiration is the storage of ATP. So any ATP that's already stored in our bodies that we didn't work for recently, we would use that first. And then it would go to ATP-CP system. So after that ATP in the body has depleted, the stored ATP, we use creatine phosphate, CP, and we break that down, and that phosphate from the breakdown is attached to ADP, and that goes back to ATP. So that creates other energy, but it doesn't last for a while as well. So then the body goes through anaerobic respiration without oxygen still. So if you're thinking of an example of when the body would use this, it could be like a sprint during track or something where you don't need much oxygen all at once, or when you're not going to need a lot of energy for a long time. So then it would go through lactic acid or alcoholic fermentation. So the main one that we're focusing on today, though, is aerobic respiration, which is longer than 3 minutes when you really need a great amount of energy. And of course, it requires oxygen. So the first step of any respiration, whether it be aerobic or anaerobic, is glycolysis. The inputs of this: 2 stored ATP that the body already has, 1 molecule of glucose, which has 6 carbons, and 2 NAD+. Now that is a low energy molecule, and but you'll see in the outputs it turns into NADH by receiving a pair of high energy electrons from glucose. Other outputs would be 4 ATP, technically a net gain of 2 3-carbon pyruvates, and that's from the breakdown of glucose. So every time glucose breaks down, it would go to a 3-carbon, which are pyruvates. Those will go to the Krebs cycle later, and the NADH are going to go to the electron transport chain. And if I didn't mention this, the ATP, they usually get stored in muscles for use later, because they also help for muscle contractions as well. And that's just a visual of the inputs and outputs for glycolysis. As you can see, the NADH, ATP, and pyruvates. The next step is the Krebs cycle, and the inputs for these is the 2 3-carbon pyruvates from glycolysis, 8 NAD+, 2 FAD, which is another low energy molecule, and 2 ADP. The outputs, carbon dioxide comes in here. If you think about it, when we breathe out carbon dioxide, this process is going on in our body. And there's also 8 NADH. That's used later for carrying energy molecules, as well as the FADH2 down below. in the electron transport chain. And then 2 ATP that are also stored in muscles. The FADH2, that comes from the FAD. It's the same thing as NAD plus and NADH, where the NAD plus takes 2 electrons from glucose to have a higher energy molecule. And then that's a visual of the Krebs cycle. You can see the inputs and outputs. One other important thing is the acetyl. That is a major contributor to producing citric acid, which is another important part of this whole respiration process. Some of the NAD plus can come from there and other important compounds. And then the third step, electron transport chain. So inputs for this, 10 NADH, that's coming from the glycolysis and Krebs cycle, and 2 FADH2, which is coming from the Krebs cycle, and 6 oxygen molecules. That's when we breathe in oxygen. And that later on is going to become just water when reacting with hydrogen. And another output, 34 ATP. So this is, of course, the time where we get most of the ATP for our bodies. And another important part is NADH and FADH2. They make more than 1 ATP per molecule. So NADH 3 ATP per molecule and FADH2 2 ATP per molecule. So that's obviously going to add up to the ATP in the end. That's a visual of the electron transport chain. You can see the inputs and outputs again. Some essential parts here, the oxygen going to the water on the right side when reacting with hydrogen, so it turns into water. And the ATP synthase, that's an enzyme where as ADP kind of passes through, ATP synthase grabs it and reacts it with phosphate, and that's how you get the ATP. As mentioned before, how ATP can break down into ADP and phosphate and the other way around. So that's how they're really making energy in this process here at the end. So when adding up all the ATP, we have the 10 NADH and the 2 FADH2, and multiply those because the 3 ATP per molecule and 2 ATP per molecule. And from glycolysis and Krebs cycle, we have some ATP from there, but not as much. So you get 38 ATP in total, and then subtract 2 for electron shuttling, and you get 36 ATP. You can also think of it this way, where it's the opposite of photosynthesis equation. So usually plants get watered, and they need sunlight, and they breathe in carbon dioxide, and they make food for themselves and breathe out oxygen. For us, we eat food, we don't make it ourselves, and we breathe in oxygen, and those are the outputs that are at the end for us. We breathe out carbon dioxide, and we have water for our body and everything. So this is a visual of the whole process. As you can see, location-wise, glycolysis is on the outside of the mitochondria, and then everything else works inside the mitochondria, like the Krebs cycle, electron transport chain. So a research study around 2009, researchers at Virginia Commonwealth University, they discovered that the protein named STAT3 was actually really important for regulating mitochondria. And of course, we all know that's the powerhouse of the cell, energy production, and that's what the body does during cellular respiration. And so the researchers did an experiment with mice's hearts, and they realized that the mice's hearts could not take in enough oxygen and produce enough ATP because they didn't have the protein STAT3. So a PhD from the same school, he's a professor there at the School of Medicine, he basically said in this quote that discovering things like new proteins that can help our bodies breathe easier or something, that can be a really important thing for the future, involving cancer, heart disease, all the things like that. These are some key terms that I mentioned throughout the video that can help you guys if you didn't understand any, and it can really help understand the process a lot more with cellular respiration. And then these are my sources. I hope today really helped out with this video, and that's it. Thank you.